Almost everything we think we might know about Dick Turpin is false. He didn't make a midnight ride from London to York, didn't ride a mystical horse named Black Bess, and his associates didn't even call him Dick. So in today's video, we're going to visit York in England to walk back in the footsteps of Turpin's final days leading up to his execution. We're looking at his most brutal crimes and trying to unpiece the fact from the fiction. The infamous 18th century highwayman Dick Turpin lives on in our collective imagination, his story captivating the interest of history lovers and English folktale lovers alike. Legendary acts have become a constant source of mystery, intrigue and speculation. Who actually was Dick Turpin? What separates the myth from the legend? In today's video, we are going to explore the final days of Dick Turpin leading up to his execution here in York City in England. Born as Richard in 1705 in Hempstead, Essex, to John and Mary, the life of Richard Turpin started off fairly normal as he began work as an apprentice butcher. Soon, though, he would find a more profitable career in crime, starting first with a sideline dabbling in stolen game. After this, Turpin decides to take it up a notch. His criminal career starts to become more serious as he becomes a member of the vicious Gregory gang in Essex, a group which would strike terror into areas of the country. The gang would break into isolated farmhouses and force the inhabitants to hand over their valuables. Turpin's knowledge of butchery made him useful in cattle stealing, but this only progressed to more sinister crimes. With Gregory, the leader of the gang, he robbed a farmhouse and poured boiling water over the owner, an old man, and raped a woman there. Eventually, most of the gang members were caught by the authorities, but not Turpin, so he put the gang days behind him and decided to turn to highway robbery. In the 18th century, highway robbery emerged as a notorious and perilous criminal enterprise on the roads of England. Infamous highwaymen of that time, often dressed in flamboyant attire, lurking along the remote roads and poorly guarded thoroughfares. There they would prey on unsuspecting travellers. Armed with pistols and demanding stand and deliver, these audacious criminals targeted carriages, coaches and lone pedestrians, seeking valuable possessions and currency. The lack of law enforcement and the vast stretches of isolated road provided a fertile ground for highway robbery. Therefore, the law-abiding citizens of the 18th century were awash with fear, especially when travelling through the countryside. Dick Turpin was to become one of the most infamous names associated with this type of crime, but history tells us his criminal antics didn't just end there. Turpin became famously known for such crimes as poaching, housebreaking, armed robbery, murder and highway robbery. Because of this, he was greatly feared at that time, prowling the area to get what he wanted. Based in a cave in Epping Forest, Turpin and his fellow highwayman Tom King would haunt the local roads, robbing passing travellers as they went along their way. Turpin would eventually go on to accidentally kill Tom King, showing us that not even his friends were safe from his antics. One of the most infamous episodes in Turpin's criminal career was his involvement in a theft of a horse in 1737. During the theft, he shot and killed a man named Thomas Morris, a servant of one of Epping Forest's keepers. After committing these murders, he fled to Yorkshire. In Yorkshire, Turpin takes on the alias of John Palmer, which he maintains from 1737 to 1739, posed as a well-heeled country gentleman. As John Palmer, he moved between Lincolnshire and Yorkshire to avoid suspicion. However, he continued to steal horses and commit other crimes, and so it wasn't long before the authorities would take notice. Horse theft had been a capital crime and punishable by death since 1545. Eventually, he makes a mistake. He gets charged for shooting a chicken in the street and threatening to shoot its owner. It wasn't long before Turpin, locked up as Palmer in York Castle, was accused of also stealing 3 horses by a Thomas Creasy, and it was for this crime that Turpin was dragged without defence barrister before a jury and sentenced to death. Turpin writes to his brother asking for help. The letter is thought to read, "Dear brother, York, February 6, 1739. I am sorry to acquaint you that I am now under confinement in York Castle for horse stealing. If I could procure an evidence from London to give me a character, that would go a great way towards my being acquitted. I had not been long in this county before my being apprehended, so that it would pass off the readier. For heaven's sake, dear brother, do not neglect me. You will know what I mean when I say, I am yours, John Palmer. Turpin's brother refuses to pay the sixpence due on the letter, and it was returned to the post office, where Turpin's old schoolmaster, John Smith, recognised his handwriting, revealing his identity as his former pupil, Richard Turpin, and therefore sentencing him to death. Smith was given a £200 reward. The cell where Dick Turpin was imprisoned is here at York Castle Museum, where it's been preserved and is one of the star attractions. During his incarceration, once it was discovered that he was the legendary Dick Turpin, crowds came from all over to visit him in his cell, and he became somewhat of a celebrity criminal, with the jailer supposedly making around £100 by selling food and drink to his visitors. Tried at the York Assizes in March 1739, Turpin, or John Palmer, was sentenced to death by hanging. Turpin's reign of terror finally ended in York on April 7th, 1793, when he was hanged here at York Tyburn, 𝐇𝐻𝐬𝐬. At the time of his execution, he was probably one of the most hated men in England. Taken through York in an open cart, along with another condemned man by the name of John Stead, who was a horse thief, the pair arrived at 𝐇𝐻𝐬𝐬 to cheers and jeers from the attending crowd, numbering in the hundreds. It is said he bowed to the spectators with an air of the most astonishing indifference and pluckiness. For over 400 years, Tyburn was a place for public executions here in York. Controlled by the Crown and administered from York Castle, the gallows here at 𝐇𝐻𝐬𝐬 were nicknamed Tyburn after the famous public execution site at Marble Arch in London. For over 400 years, Tyburn was a focal point for public executions in York. This location meant that the very first thing visitors to York would see as they arrived would be the bodies of the criminals hanging from the gallows, or crowds of people following carts as they carried convicted criminals to their final place of execution. On the day of his hanging in York, a huge crowd turned out to witness the event. There was no professional executioner, and so the role was given to a fellow highwayman, whom the sheriff would offer the task to in exchange for his own pardon and release. It is thought that Thomas Hadfield was the chosen one to perform this act. Turpin hired 5 professional mourners, supposedly each were paid 10 shillings, to follow him up the scaffold, and he put on a show for the large crowd. He wore a new frock coat and shoes so that he would look stylish. He then spoke calmly to the hangman, bowed to the spectators, and threw himself off the ladder. Newspaper reports suggested he expired within 5 minutes. The body was then taken for display in the Blue Boar pub in York. Turpin wasn't in York long enough to sample the many watering holes as a free man. However, his corpse did briefly linger in the Blue Boar pub, where there is now a Turpin room. According to the legend, the corpse of Dick Turpin was laid out in this cellar of the pub after he had been hanged at the 𝐇𝐻𝐬𝐬 in 1739. Folks queued to pay 1 penny to view it. During his lifetime, Turpin was feared and despised, but now all these years on, we are somewhat removed from his evil deeds, glossing over them for a more palatable version that romanticises his exploits and forgets his cruel actions. But why is this? In 1834, Harrison Ainsworth publishes a popular novel called Rookwood, which no doubt began and helped cement many of the fictional associations we hold towards Turpin today. The story is set in 18th century England and revolves around a Dick Turpin and his infamous highwayman exploits. It combines elements of romance, adventure and the Gothic, depicting Turpin's deeds, his relationships and his supercharged pursuit by law enforcement. It is in the novel that the invention of his horse Black Bess occurs, but it has no foundation of fact. It contains vivid and dramatic storytelling at its finest, incorporating real historical events and characters in a thrilling narrative. There was a huge popularity for it during the Victorian era, And this could be the reason Dick Turpin still holds place as a romanticised figure rather than the criminal he actually was. Ainsworth portrays Dick Turpin as a charismatic and daring highwayman, tall and well-built, with a commanding presence, a distinctive appearance with dark hair and a strong, rugged demeanour. Despite his criminal activities, the novel shows Turpin's charm and wit in order to portray him as an engaging and enigmatic character, even invoking sympathy and admiration from his readers. Did you know that it wasn't until this novel that Turpin was nicknamed Dick? Throughout his life, he was always referred to as his birth name, Richard. It just goes to show how much influence a popular book can have. Turpin's grave is tucked away on a quiet lane opposite St George's Roman Catholic Church in what resembles a small public park beyond the city centre of York. Unfortunately, body snatching was such a lucrative industry at the time, and so it wasn't long before the tables turned and the legendary thief was to have stolen from him the only thing he had left to steal: his corpse. Newspaper reports suggest around 3 a.m. after Turpin was buried, his body was dug up by a labourer. The plan was to sell it to Dr. Marmaduke Palms, a York surgeon who paid greatly for corpses for illegal dissection. However, before the trade could be completed, an angry mob is said to have reclaimed the body and carried it through the streets in a kind of triumphal manner, and Turpin was laid to rest once again. Contemporary reports suggest that Dick Turpin's body was brought here to the churchyard in St George's and laid to rest. To prevent the grave being robbed again, the coffin was filled with slaked lime, which would have caused the body to break down more quickly, therefore making it unsaleable for medical research. Now my question is this: is Dick Turpin actually buried at this gravesite? There is a lot of speculation as to whether he is or isn't. One of the pieces of evidence is that there's nothing to suggest there was a grave here prior to 1918, no church records. And it was very, very rare for felons to be buried on consecrated ground. What do you think? Let me know in the comments. So that is it. Thank you so much to everybody for watching the video. Please let me know your comments in the comments box, and give me a like if you've got all the way through, and subscribe if you want to come on more wanderlusting adventures. Take care, everyone. Bye.